Hey y'all, I hope you're having a good week without showing up on Tuesday evening class. I'm greeting you from, well, I guess I will be in Zurich by the time you see this. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of what I hope will happen this week. Robert is going to post his stuff fairly soon, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion about what he brings up. I want to talk a little bit about some of the kind of background or history of philosophy of technology, and I'm going to make this brief. I don't want to talk for very long here because I think we're going to have plenty to discuss with his stuff. When I have taught philosophy of technology in the past, I have often paired it with philosophy in the environment. And that might seem a little bit unusual. I mean, a lot of places you would have two separate courses for those two areas, but I've always thought of them as being very closely related to each other. In a certain sense, we are always thinking about the milieu in which we find ourselves. Technology, in a certain way, is about that which mediates the world and ourselves. Sometimes it creates who we are. Sometimes it frames the world for us so that it makes it legible in some way. Sometimes it cocoons us. Nevertheless, it's always a relationship with the external world. And the environment, the philosophy in the environment, is also about very similar sorts of issues. I mean, how do we how do we understand the environment? What sense do we make out of it? So I've often found that running these two things in parallel, you're actually dealing with a lot of similar sorts of issues. So when we're talking about the limits of technology, we're always implicitly asking something about nature itself. Should there be a limit? Should there be a limit on how much we engage nature, how much we transform it, what do we do to ourselves, all of those sorts of things. So those are kind of ethical issues with technology that are also implicate issues of the environment as well. So. So that's what I've often found to be an interesting kind of connection. What's interesting also is to look at the ways that our philosophical reflection on technology have changed over time. To some extent, this is a fairly young sort of approach within philosophy, or a young set of questions. I mean, questions about metaphysics, for example, go back to Plato and before. Questions about epistemology, same thing. Ethics, all of these sorts of areas are very, very old in philosophy. If you look at the writings that have actually, been directed at technology itself, those really only go back to about the Industrial Revolution. So we're talking a couple of hundred years back. Before that there were issues, discussions of the nature of science certainly, but science and technology are not necessarily the same thing. In fact, arguably technology precedes science. We were building things and refining them long before we applied the scientific method to anything at all. So, so we had technology in place, but as far as being an object of philosophical reflection, pretty recent, okay? So why does it emerge when it emerges? Well, in part, I think, it emerges because of some of the kind of social issues around the Industrial Revolution. I mean, these were, clear in just, literature, in novels and things like this. I mean, the Industrial Revolution was, exacerbating economic divisions within society. It was, causing us to all live by clocks. So we punched in, we punched out, these sorts of things. So I mean, a lot of different issues come up when you start thinking about the production of goods as being a kind of central, part of your culture, of your society. So, really, so about 200 or so years ago, and really in some ways, the person who starts it off in a big way would be Karl Marx. I mean, Marx is the one who really starts thinking about technology as having a kind of fundamental tie, a fundamental part of our human nature itself. Marx is a great synthesizer for so many reasons. And so after Marx, you start seeing other people pick up these questions. What does technology do to human society? What does it do to our consciousness? What does it do? All of these sorts of things. As you come into the 20th century, these questions only become more intense. As you have the advent of things like production lines, production belts, Henry Ford and that sort of thing. You have interchangeable parts, and so people start thinking about, well, what does it mean to move from a question of having overall expertise in building something, and now you have not expertise but competence in building one small part of something. What does that do to who we are? Hegel, a long time before this, pointed out that, in a certain sense, our expertise in the world is part of who we are. We make things in the world, and then in the making, in that process, we're coming to consciousness. We are coming to understand who we are. Well, what happens if, all that you're doing is making some small part of a Model T? Well, you're doing something very different than what people would have done 100 or more years before. What happens when you have machines that where you can offload a greater and greater part of the actual precision of making something? So whereas previously you might have somebody who was a machinist or something like that, handcrafting some part of a machine, now you have a machine making a machine, and the person who's running that machine is at best, pulling a lever, pushing a button, just making it happen. And so expertise is more and more loaded outside of human beings. And so, those sorts of discussions become, more and more prominent. And not just in philosophy. I mean, you think of things like the movie Modern Times by Charlie Chaplin. I mean, it's a great critique of technological society, among other things. Chaplin's, the first 20 minutes of the movie are just this devastating look at the factory and the kind of meaningless lives that people have within that. It's so meaningless that Chaplin's character goes crazy within about 15 minutes of this and is committed to an asylum. So, so these sorts of questions emerge, and philosophy of technology picks this up. You have people like, certainly Heidegger is important in this, but people like Jacques Ellul, people like Gabriel Marcel, a book called Man Against Mass Society, Marcuse, all sorts of people in mid-century. You find it in Sartre, you find it in a lot of people questioning what it means for us to live in an increasingly technologized world. Does this take away our uniqueness? Does this take away our, anything special about us being human? These questions were being raised 100 years earlier with Darwin, by the way. When you offload the question of the creation of humanity, and you start realizing, well, maybe it just comes from, evolutionary adaptation, now you don't need a divine figure at any particular point. So what you end up with is, questions about our uniqueness there. They come up again in the 20th century. And so all of this becomes a kind of set of questions that are clustered around a kind of industrial level technology. Of course, we are not exactly in that age anymore. We are now in an age which we might think of as information technology age. Some of the same questions apply, some of them don't. And I think those are going to be the interesting differences that we're going to be wanting to look at. On the module online, I have made some links to some of my notes from another class, where I look at some of the issues around philosophy of technology, really focusing more on the industrial version of technology, not so much on the digital, not so much on the information technology. So those are some of the, that's kind of brings us up to where we are now. Seems to me there are interestingly different questions. At a basic level, we might want to think about, questions around ethics. What should we not allow technology to do? How far should we go? Things like that. Those are interesting, but I think they are, in a certain sense, really only the tip of the iceberg, when we're going to talk about technology. I think there's a lot more interesting stuff going on than that. So that's, that hopefully will lead into what Robert has to say. I haven't seen it yet either. I've seen some of his notes. It looks very interesting, so I'm looking forward to it. And I hope that, once it's up, that we'll all be able to chime in and, have a good discussion about all of this. So anyway, thank you very much. I will talk to you soon.